Good afternoon, everybody. This is Denny from DDK Travels. We're just getting ready here. We're going to head over to the clubhouse at the SKP ranch here in Benson to meet Les. He was an airline pilot, commercial airline pilot for 31 years. And he's going to talk about airline safety and what's going on. And he's going to talk about a couple crashes, not going to get too deep. But hang in there with me on this one, folks. It's going to be a little longer, but it's going to be really educational and interesting. It's really an interesting guy. At the end, he's going to make an announcement that you're going to want to stick around for. I hope you enjoy this, and please subscribe on it. Give me your comments, and I will be with you in 2 seconds.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Les Featherston. I served as a flight crew member of a major U.S. airline for 31 years. I am going to review some of the improvements in flying safety that happened over my career and since that time. I plan to interject a couple of anecdotal moments, so I hope you are entertained by that. First off, flying safety has been a constant effort to improve the safety of flying since the very beginning. And I'm going to do a little audience participation with you here. When was the very first time that man was ever purported to have flown? If you know the answer, save that thought. If you will be reminded when I tell you the name, you'll probably say, oh yes, I remember that. And if not, that's okay too. So the very first time that man was ever purported to have flown, what was the young man's name? It was in Greek mythology, thousands of years ago. His name was Icarus, and he was in prison. He wanted to escape prison, so he took feathers and stuck them in beeswax on his arms. He flew safely out of the prison, but he enjoyed flying so much, as we all do, that he flew too close to the sun. He fell in the wax melted, he fell in the sea, and he died. Most people remember his name, Icarus. If you don't, that's okay. So the very first time that man ever flew, it was a fatality, unfortunately. Something later that day happened that will be astounding to you. I don't believe you'll remember this man's name. Icarus' father was also in prison, put wax on his arm, stuck feathers in it. He flew safely out of prison and landed on the beach. What was his name? Almost no one remembers Daedalus. That is the very first day that man is purported to have flown. Let's flash forward to my very first flight lesson. I was 13 years of age. My dad was teaching me to fly. I was cinching the seatbelt down, shutting off all the blood to my lower extremities, trying to wipe perspiration off my hands and get a grip on the control. Quite nervous, as a matter of fact. And my father said something to me that is absolute wisdom. He said, son, there is no need to die all tensed up. It just makes it harder for the undertaker to get you in the box. That is wonderful wisdom, because a relaxed, confident, knowledgeable pilot is a safe pilot. So I've thought of that 1,000 times since my father told me that in 1954. I'm going to review about 4 or 5 important safety improvements over the years that improved the safety of flying. By the way, another audience participation question here. What happened to the very first passenger ever to ride in an airplane? Unfortunately, Orville killed him. They flew around the stadium about 5 or 6 times. The propeller broke, cut part of the wing off, and they crashed, and Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge of the United States Army unfortunately suffered fatal injuries. So we didn't have a very good start to aviation safety, but things improved rapidly. Flash forward to October 30th, 1935. The Boeing Aircraft Company was just getting its feet underneath, and they developed the first B-17 Flying Fortress. On its test flight, they began the takeoff roll. The airplane continued to climb steeper and steeper and steeper until it stalled and crashed, killing the 4 crew members on board. Unfortunately, the result of this accident was that they forgot to undo the gust lock on the elevator, one of the control surfaces. A gust lock is inserted in the control surface to keep it from flopping and being damaged in wind on the ground. Having not removed that, the aircraft was totally uncontrollable, and they crashed and died. From that accident came a wonderful result. It's called the checklist. Every airline pilot in the world now is required to read every checklist. His co-pilot or captain is required to respond accordingly. And the checklist was one of the most wonderful safety inventions in the history of aviation. Let's flash forward again. It's 1956. In fact, it was June 30th, 1956. TWA launched out of Los Angeles early in the morning and headed for Kansas City. United, in a DC-8 right behind them, took off 4 minutes later. They flew into what was then uncontrolled airspace, and they collided over the Grand Canyon, resulting in the death of 128 fatal injuries. Both airplanes were destroyed and fell into the canyon. From that accident, the government instituted a total radar environment. There is no airplane flying in the United States today that isn't under radar surveillance, and separated from every other airplane by that same radar surveillance. A wonderful safety addition. It's now the early 1950s, and I have chosen to name this concise communications as a safety improvement. In World War II, pilots would get a clearance. They'd just say Roger Wilco, which was phonetically easy to understand by people of all languages and everything. Wilco meaning I will comply. The language used in aviation was pretty sloppy. It is now required since the 50s by the International ICAO, International Aviation Association, that every clearance given to every airliner must be read back specifically in detail. I'll give you an example. Blankety blank airline takeoff, maintain runway heading to 4,000 feet, turn left to 180, and climb then to 13,000 feet. That must be read back precisely. Maintain runway heading to 4,000 feet, turn to 180, continue climb to 13,000. If it's not read back, and by the way, it's recorded, if it's not read back correctly, the pilot gets a very smart slap on his hand, and he has to repeat his clearance precisely so that everyone knows what the score is. I hired on in 1969 to one of the 4 major carriers here in the United States, and worked my way from flight engineer up to co-pilot, up to captain. And I like to tell this story that a few weeks after I hired on, I was the flight engineer sitting behind the captain and the co-pilot, and the captain was reviewing his approach plate to make a landing in Bakersfield. The co-pilot was distracted, apparently looking out the window. I looked forward of the airplane, and I saw a twin-engine airplane that I thought was coming in the captain's windshield. I lunged forward and grabbed both control yokes, and instead of applying pressure, as I was yelling, pull up, pull up, pull up, I didn't apply pressure. I just jerked, and the airplane lurched up. At that point, the captain said he looked over his left window, and he said he thought the twin-engine airplane was going to hit our left engine. He estimated it missed by 15 feet. So that was a close call. It was later determined that the light plane pilot had misset his altimeter setting, and he was at the wrong altitude. We were supposed to clear each other by 500 feet. Unfortunately, it was much less than that. The result of that accident was the only person that I've ever injured in 31 years of flying for the airline. As I pulled up abruptly, a flight attendant in the back of the airplane was thrown to the ceiling. When we recovered a normal flight attitude, she fell to the floor and broke her ankle. I feel terrible about it, but I actually feel like I saved her life and many others. It was one of those unfortunate things. As I said, I hired on in the fall of 1969 after a brief Air Force career. For the first half of my career, we had many accidents in the United States Airlines that were obvious things: engine failures, mechanical issues, pilot misjudgments. Our training was such that it was absolutely incredible the way we were trained and brought up to speed. So very few accidents are caused by pilot mistakes now. For the first half of my career, as I said, many accidents were caused by mechanical issues. The second half of my career, it was most interesting. They came to us and said, we're not having the type of accidents that we can write on a checklist. There are no more mechanical failures. The airplanes are so reliable. The crews are so well trained. When we have an accident, it's totally out of the blue. And I'll give you an example. United Airlines took off from San Francisco and en route to Australia. They diverted to Hawaii because of a mechanical in Hawaii to pick up those passengers in Hawaii destined for Australia. They were not used to servicing the Boeing 747-400 in Honolulu, so they were unable to close the cargo door. They used a luggage handler to push the door shut and thought they had it locked. When the airplane took off and began to pressurize, the door unfortunately became unlocked and blew off the airplane. The really unfortunate thing is the hinges for that door were underneath first-class seats, and 11 people were sitting in their seats, strapped in their seats, enjoying their cocktails, and suddenly we're outside the airplane. Totally unpredictable accident. Back to an accident that I'm very familiar with. It was in July of 1969. I was intimately involved in this accident because I was a training student at the training center for a co-pilot seat on the DC-10. My instructor bid us farewell at noon, and he asked me if I was going home to Los Angeles. I said, no, I'm staying here to study. The other student pilots, the captain decided to stay in Denver and study. The flight engineer student decided he was going to go home. The flight instructor went and got on United 232, which you probably remember ended up in Sioux City, Iowa. That accident was one of the most unusual in the history of aviation. The fan disc for the number 2 center engine on the DC-10 disintegrated in cruise flight. It shattered all 3 redundant hydraulic systems, and they lost complete control of the airplane. They came back to the cabin and found my flight instructor, and he volunteered to go help. He came up with the bright idea of steering with the throttles, and when they'd push all the throttles 1 and 3 forward, the airplane would not descend as rapidly as it had been, but it was always descending. When they retarded the number 1 left engine throttle and advanced the number 2 engine throttle, it increased the radius of the circle that they were descending in. They made 3 circles around southern Iowa and were cleared to land anywhere they could land, a highway, anything. Miraculously, they made it to the airport at Sioux City. Unfortunately, the airplane went out of control after landing at very high speed with no flaps, no slats, and leading edge devices to slow the airplane down. They landed very rapidly. The airplane broke up, and unfortunately, 112 people lost their lives. Most of the 174 that survived credited their survival to the airplane coming to rest in 7-foot tall corn, and the corn decelerated the airplane smoothly so that they did not perish. An interesting story about that: a man walked into the bar at the Sioux City airport and said, "I'll have a double scotch." The bartender said, "Are you aware there's just been an accident here?" He says, "Yes, I was in it. I need a double scotch now." I'll share one more interesting anecdote about that accident. The captain was named Al Haynes, and a year later I landed in Sioux City, went to the Howard Johnson's restaurant, where they have the bar around the corner and all the restaurant chairs along the front. As we were finishing our dinner, my crew, a man walked out of the bar and came and said, "Are you guys airline pilots?" We said, "Are you from the FAA?" And he said, "No, I'm from the Sioux City Fire Department, and I was on duty that afternoon that United 232 crashed." I said, "Ooh." And he said, "We were down in the cornfield working on getting survivors out of the airplane and everything, when one of my deputies came over and said, 'Look up there, a half a mile away.' Dudley Dvorak, the flight engineer, had a piece of yellow fiberglass insulation from the cockpit, and he was waving it in an attempt to seek some help. The fireman went up to the cockpit of the airplane, which had broken off the main fuselage. The fireman said it didn't look like a cockpit. It looked like a great big pile of spaghetti wires. And he said there was a small opening underneath. So I laid on my belly and crawled in after Dudley told me there were 3 other pilots in the cockpit. I crawled in an attempt to rescue them. The worst thing you can see as a fireman is a decapitated body. He said, I got in there, and the captain's body was upside down in his seat, still strapped in with no head. And he said, I reached over, undid the seatbelt. Al Haynes fell from his seat, rolled over, and his head popped out like Jack in the Box. So we were all greatly relieved that he survived. Great improvements have been made over the years in safety at the airlines. I mainly discuss U.S. airlines. I have no familiarity with foreign airlines. Example, as a crew member on my airline, I was required to take 3 physicals a year, 2 for the FAA and 1 for the company. I was required to submit myself to random drug tests. I want to tell you about that. The union insisted that we have very expensive drug tests to ensure that they didn't have a false positive. We would taxi into the gate. 99% of the time it would be a lady who would intercept us, give us the handcuff signal that you can't leave the cockpit. She'd come in the airplane, lock us in the cockpit. And by the way, we've been flying for the last hour or so without the ability to go to the restroom. We're making an approach and landing and taxiing in. At the time that you most wanted to go, you can't go, and she's got you locked in the cockpit for another 20 minutes while everybody deplanes. Then she takes you down to a restroom, and you have to wait for a man to come in and observe you doing the deed. Very embarrassing. However, this is very important. In the 13 years that I was randomly drug tests, there were over 6,000 pilots at my airline. We each got a random drug test about 3 to 4 times a year. I calculated that to be over 750,000 expensive drug tests, and I'd like you to guess, audience participation again, how many positives they found. 0. 850,000 drug tests on over 6,000 pilots at United, and oops, erase that, and about 850,000 drug tests while I was employed of our 6,000 pilots, and another 28,000 pilots were also submitted to random drug testing, and a giant 0. Thank you for paying for that. It improved safety dramatically. Improvements in aviation flying safety were crew rest rules. When my father was flying for a major airline in the late 40s, they would fly till they dropped physically. My company instituted with the FAA regulations requiring us to have additional rest periods. Example, if I flew beyond 12 and a half hours today, I had to have, example, if I flew 14 hours today, I had to have double that in rest period, or 28 hours before I could fly again. That was wonderful to be rested and fresh instead of tired and fatigued and just continuing on and on and on like Charlie Lindbergh. The other things that were augmented or brought into condition is called augmented crew members. On an example, on a long flight over 12 and a half hours, there must be a third pilot on the two-pilot airplanes now, called an augmented crew member or long ranger. If the flight is over 16 hours, it requires a complete additional crew aboard. And the airlines have had to put beds and bunks in the airplane, sacrificing passenger seats and costing them money to accommodate those rest areas. I spent approximately a year and a third of my life in the training center at my airline. Each time I'd go to a new airplane, about 12 times during my career, I would spend 6 weeks at the training center learning the new airplane. After I was qualified on it, I had to spend 11 days a year in recurrent training, 2 periods during the year, and a day of emergency or evacuation training. That was 12 days out of the year that I had to go back to my headquarters training center, and all of us were required to go and submit ourselves to that training. The main safety feature that I find so interesting about aviation and U.S. airlines is that, example, when a terrible automobile accident happens and there are fatalities, the sheriff or highway patrolman might spend as much as 45 minutes with his clipboard notating that, oh, the tires were bald on that car, maybe the headlight was out on that car, etc. When an airliner crashes, they go to great lengths to find out what caused it. And I want to give you an example from the late 50s. An airplane took off in New York City. As it gained altitude approximately 2,000 feet, the rudder was given a hard over signal electronically. The crew couldn't recover. The airplane rolled over and it dove into 20 feet of swampy mud. Scuba divers for about 6 weeks went out in the mud and crawled around and tried to recover every single piece of that airplane they could find. It was determined that the servo that caused the rudder to lock over had shorted wires in it. And to determine how those wires were shorted, they went back to the factory and observed the gentleman who was manufacturing those servos. He was trying to insert 4 wires, tiny wires, through a very small hole. He was frustrated, so he reached over in his desk drawer, opened it, pulled out a pair of metal tweezers, reached through the hole, grabbed the wires, and pulled them through. In doing so, he stripped the insulation off the wires, and those wires shorted out and caused the airplane accident. There were about 77 of those airplanes in service that day. They grounded them all and found 14 of them with these scraped wires. A huge improvement in flying safety. An additional thought about Sioux City. The fan disc disintegrated in cruise flight. The fan disc is about 6 foot in diameter, about a foot thick, and it weighs a ton, and it's made out of titanium alloy. When that company that manufactured that engine built that disc, they used what was called a 2-melt process. They melted that fan blade down, cast it as an ingot, and melted it down a second time, scraped the sludge off the top, and then formed it into the fan disc. They determined that that fan blade was cracked for 7 years before it disintegrated. Thence that accident, they now do a triple melt process. They melt the ingot again and scrape the sludge off of it, the crud, and make a 3-melt process to make a much improved fan blade. That's the sort of concern and attitude they have towards flying safety. An idea to explain to you how safe modern airplanes are. In the early 1960s, I went to a famous aircraft manufacturing plant in Wichita. They were manufacturing the least expensive 2-seat airplane virtually in the world. Hence, the engineering of that airplane was not as consequential as, say, a Boeing 747 or a modern airliner. The day I was there, they were strength testing a wing off this very inexpensive airplane. When I got there, the wing looked like a bow about to release an arrow. It was bent in huge fashion, and they had laid several thousand sandbags on the wing. While I was there, they gently laid a 2.5 pound, a kilo sandbag on the wing. One of the engineers screamed out, "That's structural deformation, that's structural deformation. The wing will not return to its original shape. We've damaged it." I asked him what was the G-force that they had applied to the wing. It was 13.8 Gs. That aircraft is restricted to 3 Gs as flown by pilots all over the world. I asked him what the failure point was. He said, "We don't know, but it's out past 20 Gs. That's how brilliantly engineered aircraft are. He also told me that aircraft engineering is approximately 5 times greater strength-wise than a bridge. So that should give you some great confidence in the structure of airplanes. Modern airplanes are made with composite materials, which are much better than the metal wings that I flew. So that should give you a good deal of confidence in the structure of the airplane. A personal experience that I had as a co-pilot on the Boeing 767, we departed Los Angeles to the west. We're doing what's called the loop departure. And the Boeing 767 has a giant A-pillar, approximately 8 or 10 inches wide, right here in front of my right eye. Something possessed me as we started that turn to lean forward and look around the A-pillar. I did, and at that point I did Harpo marks. I grabbed the controls, jerked them, pulled up. The captain said, "What the?" And I said, and he said, "Mid-air collision." And I said, he said, "When you compose yourself, go ahead and report it to the air traffic controllers." I did so. I called them and said, "This is blankety blank airline flight so-and-so. We just had a near miss with a large single-engine airplane." And they said, "Did you get the number of the airplane?" I said, "No, but it was a large Mooney painted cream, white, and brown. The pilot was a very large man wearing a plaid shirt with chrome sunglasses." And everybody said, "Ah, ha, 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 ha." Anyway, that leads me to the invention of a wonderful device that's required on every airliner in the world now. Every transport-size airplane must have what's called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. This is such that without air traffic controllers being involved at all, if two airplanes are approaching each other in any attitude or configuration where they may collide, an automated system tells this airplane to turn right and climb, tells this airplane to turn right and descend, and it gets louder and louder and louder. I'll give you an example. Only in this airplane would it say turn right and descend, and it would say turn right and descend now, turn right and descend now, turn right and descend now, turn right and descend now. The system also is very effective in other conditions too. If you approach landing without your landing gear down, it says configuration, 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 and gets louder and louder until you correct the problem. It has other additional features, but that's the main emphasis, is that it is like a voice in the back of the pilot's head giving him information. And this system, by the way, was developed by the United States Navy in the early 80s. They initially used women's voices saying, turn right, descend, turn right, descend. And they found that the Navy pilots could not hear the women's voices. So they had to switch to male voices. Sorry about that, girls. The TCAS system it was an augmentation of the 1950s, late 1950s radar environment air traffic control system that we now operate under. Every single airplane in flight, even on the ground, in the United States is known, its exact whereabouts, by air traffic control and computers that keep us separated. So that system was incredible as a result of the earlier Grand Canyon accident. Early in modern airline aviation, the concept of velocity speeds was developed. They had airliners attempting takeoff and running off the end of the runway with quite unsubstantial results. And so they developed a velocity system whereby at a certain point down the runway, one pilot not flying announces a predetermined speed based on weight, that aircraft's design and everything, called Velocity 1 or V1. And if you have not achieved a certain speed by V1, you are to reject the takeoff. Abort was the word we used. And that allowed you enough runway remaining to get the airplane safely stopped. Once past V1, Velocity 1, you are committed to flight. Most people don't know this, but the certification process on all modern airliners requires that with the loss, complete total loss of thrust from the most critical engine on the airplane, after V1, the airplane still must accelerate on the remaining engines and attain flight safely and be able to be controlled and flown around until the fuel's reduced to landing weight and the airplane can be safely landed. This is a wonderful, wonderful area of improvement that came along right before I became an airline pilot. In the mid-1970s, the captain on the airline was still considered to be a godlike personality. My father in TWA, late 1940s, and myself at my airline in the 70s was completely submissive to the captain. He made the decisions. You sat there and kept your mouth shut. The accident that happened with a captain's making poor judgment, there were two of them, one at my company, and the end result of that accident was the captain made the decision to continue flight with a suspected problem. It didn't occur, but he suspected it did, until he exhausted his fuel and landed 20 miles short of the airport. Psychologists took a hold of that accident. They developed a multi-million-dollar program of study that was indoctrinated into every airline pilot that I know of, and it was called Crew Resource Management. As a co-pilot, I had a safety word: I am not comfortable, meaning that I don't like your decisions, sir. And if the captain's voice was recorded, it was always recorded. If the captain's voice was recorded rejecting my interjection of my concerns, he was in serious trouble. It was a wonderful, wonderful study program that we all underwent, and were informed that, yes, as a pilot, even brand new junior pilot, you still are responsible for being a member of the crew and have your thoughts and additions and contributions to flight safety recognized. I'd like to remind you that the air traffic control system, i.e. United States Airlines, hauls about 2.9 million passengers on an average day. Keep that number in mind. Almost 3 million passengers per day. I believe that's on, I won't go there. I don't know how many flights a day, but it's many. Every single day. It was February 12th of 2009 when a U.S. airline lost a hull. It was a commuter airline, unfortunately. Lost a hull, resulting in the death of everyone on board. It was 2 weeks short of 16 years later. 2 weeks short of 16 years when the most recent accident occurred, the collision in Washington, D.C. at Reagan National Airport, resulting in the loss of the American Airlines commuter flight and the Army helicopter. I won't go into my opinion of what I think caused that accident, but I will tell you that people made serious mistakes in not following flight corridors, routes, and in congested areas. I'm also very critical of the Army for using night vision goggles in that situation. Just totally unnecessary for training purposes. Use night vision goggles out here, out west in the desert, instead of in a highly congested area like that. Anyway, keep that in mind. I didn't do the math on that, but 3 million passengers a day for almost 16 years without a fatal hull loss is absolutely incredible to show you how safe modern airlines are. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed learning about airline safety as much as I've enjoyed presenting it to you. I want to just wrap my career very shortly and say thank you. I came from a single engine jet fighter pilot mentality to the airline. I was the meanest fighter pilot in the whole world during the Vietnam era, and came to the airline. It was a very difficult transition. I was used to flying formation, I was used to dropping bombs, I was used to just basically raising Cain in an airplane, and now I have to fly pretty much straight and level and go where they tell me. And it was a difficult transition. I used a technique that changed everything for me. I'm only going to give you one example, but I was the flight engineer. They came to the cockpit and said that a lady was very, very upset back in the cabin. So I went back and I sat next to her and talked to her, and I said, "Are you afraid of flying?" And she said, "No, I'm not afraid of flying." I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "It's my husband. I'm afraid he's cold." And I said, "Would you explain to me what you mean by that?" And she says, "He's deceased and he's in a casket in the baggage pit, and I'm afraid that he's getting cold." And I said, "Ma'am, I have to go out and do a walk around to the airplane. I will go by the baggage pit. You look out this window right here, and I will give you a thumbs up after I check on him." I explained to her how the air conditioning comes out of the ceiling, goes down where the passengers are seated, then goes through the floor into the cargo compartment, and that he is virtually the same identical temperature that we are. She was the last passenger to deplane. She got off, came up, and said, "Thank you very much," and gave me a kiss. And that changed my whole career. I began to look for opportunities to help people instead of just move the airplane from point A to point B. It was the most incredibly defining moment of my 31-year airline career. Thank you again. I know most of you are asking, how come airliners will do an auto land? In other words, make an automatic landing. And why can't that be instituted when an incident occurs in flight incapacitating the pilots? It is an incredibly complicated maneuver to auto land. You have to have extreme knowledge of how to marry all three autopilots together so that they coordinate the flight. You have to know when to change altitudes, flip switches, etc. It's just not feasible at this point. On that note, before I retired from my airline, flying the 747, before I retired, I was privileged to be a passenger on 5 unmanned airliners. I know that sounds very unusual to you in the 1990s, flying on an unmanned airliner. I did so. They were not unwomaned. Autoland airliners were a program instituted in the 90s where the airplane could land automated if all 3 autopilots agreed, and everybody was coordinated to make the landing. However, it was a very expensive training program from which the airlines never benefited because they seldom used that significant system, and the weather was not quite that bad, is the truth of the matter. Both of the actual real-life auto landings that I did were almost catastrophic. I landed at Los Angeles, a beautiful evening, you could see for miles. As we decelerated to about 100 miles an hour, we ran into a cloud of fog, a bank of fog. Our visibility was so bad we could not even imagine what to do. We started screaming on the radio, how much runway do we have remaining? The primary result of the incident was another commercial airliner had landed right in front of us. He had switched over to ground control, which is signal that you are off the runway. You do not change frequencies from tower to ground control until you're off the runway. He switched to ground control and said, I need a tug. I cannot see to taxi in this fog. The tower controller that happened to be sitting next to the ground controller overheard this. And as I landed, he suddenly looked at a modern safety device, radar of where every airplane is on the runway, and he began to command us, stop, stop, flight so-and-so, stop now, stop, emergency stop, 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 stop. We rolled up to about 100 feet behind the other airplane and finally got the airplane stopped after we made our emergency braking maneuver. So Autoland is not all it's cracked up to be. My second actual Autoland incident was landing in a whiteout. Snow on the ground, about a foot deep. Snow falling, so there was no visibility. The clouds were white. Everything is pure white. You can barely see the runway. So we elected to make an Autoland. We touched down. The airplane, it's actually quite scary because you're coming down, and when you look at the radio altimeter, it says 100 feet, 70 feet, 60 feet. The auto throttles go and shut the engines to idle, and you still can't see the ground. The airplane starts a flare maneuver. You're still in the air. Suddenly, 2 runway lights go by like this, and you touch down. It's terrifying for pilots who love to be in command of the airplane. The next thing to happen is the airplane noses over so that the nose wheel tracks down the center line on a radio beam. Almost always in an Autoland, there's a little crosswind, so when the airplane nose wheel touches down, it corrects back to the center line. You expect that sudden kind of abrupt turn to go down the center line. Our airplane turned and just departed right off the right side of the runway. The co-pilot and myself slammed our foot on the left rudder as hard as we could and prevented the airplane from departing the runway. But we grounded the entire fleet for 6 months until they were able to find the problem and correct it. And this is your captain speaking. I'd like to welcome you aboard our flight today. We're planning 2 hours and 32 minutes en route to destination. We'll be cruising at 37,000 feet. And I hope you don't mind that I'll be working remotely from home today.